We're now going to model just a set of stairs to lead up to the door. And that's really going to help when the terrain is intersecting with the object, so that we have stairs leading up and not just this giant gap between the door and the bottom. So we're just going to add in a cube object and just in the model mode move it into position just by the door. I'm just scaling it. And I have condensed or added in the side element and the chimney element and just drag them to be part of the building one. And I did add that little bit of trim just on the top of the side. And then I did move up the entire object too, so we can see what it is we're working with. So going back to this cube, we're just going to scale it to fit in and match up with basically the bottom. And I am going to be creating the stairs with an extrusion, so I just want to set the height of this to be around what one stair is going to end up being. And then in the attributes for the object, we can set the X, so the direction leading up to the building, setting that to about 8. And that's should be okay. And move it out so we don't have too much of an intersection. And then we can make it editable. C on the keyboard just to make it editable. Switch over to polygons, and now we can see the different polygons we have, and we're just going to very quickly or really easily select these polygons, M and then T for extrude, and we can just pull these up and then deselect. So spacebar to go back to the selection, hold down Control, click that first polygon, spacebar again to go back to the extrude. And if you want to do this in a different view to be able to see a little bit better the height, you could also use a grid as well. But just slowly working our way through. I'm going to turn off the only visible elements just so I can deselect as I move along. And then just continue pulling that up. And let's just take a look, and it looks like we're meeting the door, and we've got this larger area. So let's just go ahead and leave that as a larger surface. And what we want to do is remove all of these extra polygons on the sides because we don't need them. And we're going to start by taking the top 2 polygons, making sure that only select visible elements is back on. Just select the top 2. And what we can do is under structure, we can dissolve it. And we can do the same thing with all of these side polygons. Now if you want a quick way to just select those, you can move over, let's go into the top view, use the rectangular selection, and just select the edge and dissolve it, and go to the other edge and dissolve. And the bottom also needs the same. So we can select all of those, or you can use the rectangular selection on the side view to just drag out and select all of those, and then dissolve. So now we just need to make sure there's no extra points. Go over to the point mode, and we have a few extra points showing up. You could either highlight them and delete them, or you could use the optimize. And we will need to select just about everything, and then optimize. And there's probably another process that needs to be done to remove those. I'm just going to remove them manually, go into the point mode, select all of those points, just hit delete, and then those top ones as well. So now we just have the stairs. And if you want to add an edge to them, you can. But like I was saying before, this is really for more of distant objects. I'm not too worried about the close-ups at the moment. If you think that the stairs are maybe too large, you can select the object. I'm just going to go to the model mode, size, and we can scale it. And push the object back. If you need to add additional stairs, at this point now, because I've removed all the extra polygons, it would be more difficult. But I think this should be okay. It's just getting the height to match up. And I'm going to adjust the width, just kind of bringing that in on the z-axis. So now all we have to do is set up the UV map for the stairs. So we can do exactly what we did for the other two elements, the side and the chimney, and just use the wall, because there's a lot of available space that won't be seen in exactly the same angle and shouldn't show up as repeating. If you need to, you can, of course, make new textures, but I'm really trying to reduce the amount of textures being used in images as reference, because it's going to make it a lot easier to duplicate the objects or show large quantities of them, and a lot of different clones or instances. So we'll go to the cube, and I'm going to switch over to the UV. And actually, I'm going to go back and I want to assign that material. It's easier just to drag it onto it for the walls, and then go back and figure out what we're going to use to set this up. Most of the projection modes will work quite well. You can see there are quite a few polygons, and at the moment we don't really have the view within the texture map, and it is scaled incorrectly. So if you need to, you can also load that texture back in. I did end up closing the program, and because the texture itself is not being used as part of the texture editor, it is no longer in the memory. So I'm going to just open that back up, and we do need to scale this in a couple of different ways to scale it. I might just use the transform and bring the X down to 0.5, which should set it correctly, and then we can move this into a position. Keep in mind, if we do go outside of the map, it is going to just start tiling on the other side. So we don't really need to worry about going outside of the UV, although it's typically not suggested. So we could place it pretty much anywhere, but also remember that once we get up to the top, we do have kind of a faked ambient occlusion that is on the diffusion map, so we may not want that to show up. And if you don't want it to be by the door, so you don't pick up any similar elements, you can just kind of move it over to the other side. And now you can see the stairs showing up in the render. If you want to bevel the edge to pick up a highlight, you could just select all of the edges and bevel them. You will need to restructure the UV map if you do decide to do that. and it looks like my display is once again a little bit off. But for the most part, if we were going to bevel this, we wouldn't need to bevel all the edges, just whatever we would want to pick up a highlight. So if we go to the edges, what would be the best are the fronts of the stairs. And if we select all of those edges, and then you can M and S for bevel, you can just add a little bit of a bevel to that edge, and that will help pick up a highlight. Now that it has created new polygons, it's also generating additional polys. So I'm going to create n-gons in the attributes because we don't need to have all the extra geometry. But we will need to run that UV projection again because of the way this was beveled. I'm just going to undo that. I want to note, just because we're using the same material doesn't mean that we can't generate some more specific maps, specifically the normal map, and then copy and paste the material to have a specific normal for that object, but still everything else will run through the texture. And essentially just creating a mix. And there is a technique you can use for the normal map to avoid having to create additional polygons, and it has to do with using that UV edge that's generated from the texture. So if we switch over, and I'm going to load that texture back in, and I think I may just create a new one because I do not want to overwrite this file. And I will be reducing the scale of this. It's just to get the normal to match up without having to create any additional UVs. I'm going to create after selecting the UV polygon, go to the Create UV Mesh layer, and you will need to select the object first. Now it might create, in this case, a bunch of lines we don't need, but let's just go ahead and save the texture. And I'm going to show you how we can create a pretty cool normal out of this. And there might be a setting so you can turn off those extra lines from being generated. I'm just going to manually clean it up. So this is what the file looks like in Photoshop. We can see those extra lines. I'm just going to use the marquee tool and go in and just kind of delete those from the UV mesh layer. So transforming the selection. And you might need to change your interpolation type if you're getting any blurred edges. But just working our way through, transforming the selection, moving it into place, or you could just go in there and fine-tune and use a brush. So I'm going to do this for the other side as well. So now the mesh layer is cleaned up, and what we can do is use these lines to manipulate the normal or create a normal that gives the illusion that there is extra geometry, and that will help pick up an edge so that we don't have to create polygons. I'm going to create a duplicate of the layer, and what we want is something sunken in. So I do need to invert, so Control I, give us black, and this alone will work to generate that kind of normal. So what I'm going to do is go to the history and create new document from the current state, just flatten it, and we can go up to the NVIDIA Tools Normal Map filter. I'm going to do a 4x4 sample. Scale of 20 is fine. I'm going to use a biased RGB, making sure that we have the inverted Y. And this will allow you to work or kind of extrude in both directions. And it doesn't really give the kind of depth that a max RGB would. It extrudes it in both directions. So this alone will allow you to create or apply this normal in order to give the illusion that there's polygons there. And then you can go one step further if you want to add additional details by using the other layers. But let's just take a look. I'm going to save this out, and we can take a look at it as the normal for the stairs. So what we'll need to do is go to the material for the wall and copy, so Control-C, Control-V to paste it. So now we have a duplicate. The duplicate should be the first one on the list. And I can underscore stairs. And then we're going to replace the material that's on there with the new duplicate. So we double click, and now we can change that normal over to the stairs normal, keeping in mind that we're not going to have any other detail from the other normal, so we may need to blend. But I just want to show you how this can give the illusion or show those edges. And you can already see in the OpenGL those stair edges showing. Let's take a look at a render. And this wasn't meant to be rendered so closely, so it is of course going to look a little pixelated. I also want to adjust my Phong angle, bringing that down. You could increase it as well if you wanted to get more shading around the edges. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. If we need to use a larger sampling size, we could do that. But for the most part, we're able to pick up on these edges without having to add additional geometry. And for a distant render, that's going to be a really nice way to decrease the memory of the scene and the amount of images needed. So then if we need to go in and manipulate the normal or even blend it together with the existing one, it's going to be pretty easy. So we can open up the wall material, and I have a couple of normals I've created. I'll just use the first one, and I'm going to duplicate the layer into a new document. And we can do the same thing with the stair normal edge. I'm just going to select canvas and copy and paste. And now we can use one of the blending modes in order to overlay that. And this will have an extra image for if you wanted to save that out and replace it with this image, or directly within Cinema we could set up the exact same thing. I'm just going to grab from the bump and paste it into the normal so that I can just select the first normal, and then we're going to change this over to layer, select layer, and we can add another image, which is going to be the stair normal edges, and then select a blending mode, and we should be able to use the soft light just to get that to show up. So now we can use both normals on the stairs without having to create any additional images. So it's a pretty nice little technique to avoid excess geometry, because really my intentions are to create a couple thousand copies of this to create a city, or variations of this, modifying the maps here and there to create more variation of that, or moving the geometry through the existing UV maps. So minimal polygon amounts is going to be desired. It's going to speed up render time and overall make the scene more responsive. But looking at it from the side over here, we can see that little edge showing up and getting highlighted. So we could do that for the top for the chimney as well, or even the wall and the different walls on the main model, using that UV edge and adding another normal or manipulating the first normal to create those nice fine lines, and that way we don't have to add any more geometry.